What I want to do today is talk a bit about market research. And I know most of you have not had a market research class. The marketing research that is in the simulation is all really neatly summarized for you. It'd be nice if in the real world the data came to us that way. It doesn't. It typically requires a lot of analysis. In fact, people who work in the analytics area, data analytics, tell me that about 80 to 90% of their time is spent just getting the data ready to analyze. Just putting it in a form that you can actually do an analysis on. And then the remaining 10% is actually doing the analysis. So I want to give you a sense of the tools we use. So today I'll talk about what I call the marketing research toolbox. They're basically 6 sets of tools that I will explore with you. I don't really expect you to learn how to do any of what I'm going to talk about, but I want you to know what these tools are, when they're appropriate, and when they're not. I visit with managers all the time, and they often have their favorite form of market research. So everything becomes that type of research, and it's not always appropriate. People love focus groups. We talk a bit about focus groups. Focus groups are always fun. A group of people talking, and you can just sit behind a two-way mirror and watch. They're really interesting and can be very enlightening about certain things. But they're terrible for doing things like forecasting or for trying to figure out what product to put in the market. So I want to give you a sense of what kinds of questions different tools answer. We could define research in really 2 broad categories. There's what we call secondary research. Secondary research, it already exists. Somebody else has already collected the data and summarized it for you in many cases. I'll give you some examples in a moment. But there are a lot of industry-specific resources that track sales, that track satisfaction, that track advertising, that you would probably want to follow. The other type of research we call primary research. Primary research involves actually going and collecting data yourself or having somebody do it for you. And it falls into 2 broad categories as well. There's qualitative research. Qualitative research really tries to get questions about why or how. How do you buy that product? How do you use that product? And then there's quantitative research, which we use to get numbers. We're interested in how many are we likely to sell. If we run this advertisement, what's that likely to sales? So let me talk a little bit first about secondary research. As I said, it's already out there. Some of it's absolutely free. Some of it you have to pay for. Certain specialized industry sources you have to pay for. But relative to actually going and collecting the data yourself, it tends to be pretty inexpensive. You can also get it pretty quickly because the data is already collected. The problem is that you don't always know how accurate it is. Now, a lot of the commercial vendors of data do a very good job of validating their data and telling you how to select it. You can rely on it, but not always. And it may be the case that there's data, but it might not be a good match for the question you're trying to answer. So there's some advantages and disadvantages. All kinds of secondary data out there. Firms capture a lot of secondary data. They can do a lot with it. So, for example, just information that you capture as part of a transaction. Sales invoices, call reports by salespeople's expense accounts, credit memos, warranties and so forth. Now, a lot of firms really fail to make good use of this. One of the things that I often find myself doing with small businesses is helping them just understand how much data actually walks in the door that could be used for purposes of planning. But they have to capture it, and then they have to do an analysis of it. But you've got customers who are coming in all the time. You can ask them questions. You can capture their demographic information. You can capture what they're buying, how much they're buying, how often they're buying. They're now large syndicated services. By syndicated, I mean simply that you subscribe to them, that capture a lot of this type of data for marketers. So, for example, Nielsen, who we all think of when we think about television ratings, actually collects lots of different kinds of data, and television ratings are only a really small part of their business. They capture scanner data at the supermarket. They and one other firm, Symphony IRI, capture data at grocery stores, pharmaceutical places, and so forth, and then organize it, arrange it, and sell it back. But it's basically in-store capture of data. There are also all kinds of published works out there, directories, periodicals, statistical sources, financial records. If you want to do competitive analysis, there's lots of really interesting data on publicly traded firms in their annual 10K, which is a report they have to file. And there's often lots of information about market share, about plans for the future. They're very, very useful for competitive analysis. There are various commercial sources. There's a firm out in Redlands called ESRI, that is in the business of developing geodemographic data. So what they will sell you is a profile of a local zip code. So if you're interested in any particular zip code, they'll tell you who lives there. Really important if you're doing things like trying to figure out where to put a store, a fast food location, a restaurant, or what have you. But that's available for purchase. There are diaries. Again, Nielsen also provides diaries. There are others that do that, where people are actually asked to record their purchases. They used to be literally diaries where people would write things down. Now they actually have a wand and they scan what they've purchased. There's store audit data. You walk into information on what's in particular stores. I talked about scanner data. There's all kinds of advertising data out there. Who's advertising? How much? How much are they spending? Where are they advertising? All that's available for sale. I would encourage you, as you think about your interviewing, to identify the sources of information that are used in whatever industry you're interviewing in. If you're interviewing in multiple industries, then you may want to do this for multiple industries. But what are the common sources that are used? And get familiar with them. So, for example, if you're going to go to work for a consumer packaged goods company, a lot of what they do is done with, around planning, is done with scanner data. So you probably learned something about scanner data, about Nielsen or Symphony. You work in the pharmaceuticals business. There's a data set. IMS International is the firm, and I'm sure IMS at one time stood for something, but they're now just IMS International. They collect data on all the prescriptions that are written in the United States. And you can buy that. So you can find out how many prescriptions for a particular drug are written, where they're being written, the dosages, and so forth. Very, very important if you happen to be in that business. So you really want to think about, if you're interviewing with a company, how do they do their planning? What information do they use? And what can you learn about that information in advance of an interview, so you could actually have a knowledgeable conversation about how they go about doing planning. This is what scanner data looks like, by the way, when it's purchased. Comes now you just download it. You just come with a CD-ROM. But you see what's captured there. So when your purchase is being scanned in the supermarket, they're picking up, if you're a frequent shopper, your household ID, the brand bought this purchase, they combine that with information from the last purchase. So what did you buy last time? By the way, that's a really useful measure of brand loyalty. Are you buying the same thing now that you bought last time? Simple measure. What was the price per ounce? What was the price per ounce for various competitors at that time? Was the brand that was bought advertised in the past week? Was it on display? Was there an aisle display or an end cap? Was a coupon used? How many were purchased? So a lot of really interesting, rich information that allows you to do analyses on consumer products, frequently moving consumer products. If you're a brand manager in a company that sells these products, you get a report for the whole United States, usually every Friday, that you can then look at. It's great to have that much information, except that when it arrives at 3:30 on Friday afternoon, and your boss calls and says, by the way, I've just been looking at the data, and our market share is down 1.5 points in Louisville, Kentucky. Why? What that usually means is you're working all weekend to answer the question. Now, sometimes the answer is really easy, but sometimes it takes some digging. But that's scanner data. The U.S. government collects all kinds of data, and the great thing about that data is most of it is free. You can go online and get it. And that's not always in the most user-friendly form. Doesn't always carry the immediate answer you're looking for, but there's an enormous amount of data that the government generates. We're all familiar with the census, and we're about to have another decennial census coming up early next year. That's where we count everybody. But in fact, that's only one of many censuses that the Census Bureau does. They do a census of agriculture. So if you're selling farm equipment, or you're selling fertilizer, or anything that would be relevant to agriculture, there's lots of information about number of farms, type of farms, what's being grown, how much land is fallow, what type of irrigation is being used. I mean, just a really rich array of information that kind of describes that sector. There's also a census of construction industries. So if you want to know what's being built, this is a place to go. There's a census of finance, insurance, and real estate. So if you happen to be in this business, again, there's lots of data collected on the firms that are in these businesses and how they do business. There's a census of governments. Government is a really big market. When I say government, that's not just the federal government, that's state government, it's local government. It's a really big market. And the Census Bureau actually does a census of governments. It's a census of manufacturers, census of mineral industries, so if you're interested in mining, census of the retail trade, census of service industries, of transportation, communication, utilities, of wholesale trade. So lots and lots of information about industries. And then, of course, there's the population census that we're all familiar with. The population census doesn't really ask very many questions. We're still fighting over what's going to get asked next year, but it probably won't be more than about 10 questions. But it's useful for just counting numbers of people and numbers of households. However, to supplement that information, the Census Bureau also does the American Community Survey. It's not a census. Census we try to count everybody. But the American Consumer Survey is a survey of about 3 billion people every year with lots of detail. Things about your house. What kind of house do you live in? What kind of appliances do you have? What kind of automobiles do you own? How frequently do you drive? Just a lot of information about just the characteristics of the population. Again, very useful if you're trying to gauge demand. Here's some more examples of secondary data, industry information. I won't take time to read them, just want you to know that's out there for your use. In fact, a colleague of mine says, we're swimming in data in marketing. We've got more data than we can actually use. So sometimes you have to figure out what you're going to pay attention to and what you're not going to pay attention to. With all kinds of measures. And by the way, 2 weeks from now, I'll talk specifically about a lot of these specific measures, what they are, what they mean. But they're commonly tracked by different organizations. And so, some useful websites for you might find helpful. There's the Census website. It's a fascinating place to go and like numbers. The American Marketing Association site has a lot of information, including, by the way, a standard dictionary of marketing terms. So it's a set of terms that have been vetted by professionals that this is what it actually means. Moody's provides information about companies. D&B provides information about companies. AC Nielsen, NPD, Symphony all provide data about sales, advertising, pricing, and so forth. So lots and lots of data available to you. When you are looking at secondary data, it's important to ask some questions about it. And by the way, in the world where you have Google and you can go search for things, you need to be really, really careful about using data that you obtain with Google. There is a lot of fake news, to use a term that's commonly thrown about on Google. People throw things out all the time without any source. And then people pick it up and repeat it, and it's as though it's real, when in fact it's not. So as you look at any data, you might want to ask yourself, first of all, what was the purpose of the study, or what was the purpose of the data collection? What were they trying to do? By the way, if the answer was that they were trying to create data to support a particular point of view, you may want to be careful with that. You want to know who was responsible for collecting the data. Were they an objective source? Census Bureau is a very objective source. They take great pride in being non-political and take great pains to validate their data. On the other hand, there are organizations that are in the business of what we call advocacy research. That is, you bring them a particular opinion and they'll go collect data to support the opinion. So you want to be careful about that. Who's collecting the data? Do they have an agenda? What was actually collected? You'll often see summaries of information, but you can summarize information in lots of different ways. What was the actual data? When was the data obtained? Data could be very, very good, but be old. Data is not like good whiskey. Good whiskey gets better as it gets older, as it ages. That's not true of data. And so unless you're interested just in a history lesson, you really want to be careful about when the data were collected. Because there are things that change over time. There are events that occur at one point in time that can have an influence. So, for example, if you were looking at retail sales in Houston this past weekend, you would have noticed that they went down a lot. Oh, wow, what's happening? You might know what happened in Houston? They had a deluge, rain, flooding. And guess what? When streets flood, people don't go to stores. So we can sort of explain that. But the data are kind of unique to that event, and once you know that what was going on, you kind of have an explanation for why the data look the way they do. But you need to be really careful that you understand what was going on at the time the data were collected. If it was a survey, then who was in the sample? Who did they actually talk to? How did they get collected? How did they get selected? And there are lots of surveys that are put out by organizations for purposes of entertainment that you really need to be careful of with respect to relying on as being representative of the population. So Cosmopolitan Magazine does lots of surveys of its readers on all kinds of topics. That's great. Makes for entertaining reading. But is a Cosmopolitan reader typical of the U.S. population? No. First of all, it's primarily women, so we've already lost most of the men. It tends to be somewhat more upscale, more educated, more fluent. Tends to be folks who are somewhat more interested in fashion. And so they have a very specific characteristic of their readership. And if you're interested in that type of person, a survey of the readership would be really useful. But there are a whole host of questions where it wouldn't really give you a very accurate picture. For the data from an appropriate geographic region, or was the data collected in an area that is not very representative, or it may be representative of that area, but that area itself is part of a much larger geographic region that has a lot of diversity. I can assure you that if you did a survey on barbecue sauce in North Carolina, you will get different results than if you do a survey of barbecue sauce in Texas. And if you know anything about those two states, you know that they mean two different things when they talk about barbecue. They use the language differently. And then finally, is kind of a check on the information that you may have found. Is it consistent with other things? Is it consistent with other data? If it's consistent with other things that I've been able to find, then I'm going to have some confidence in it. And if it seems to be an outlier, it's the only study, the only source that seems to suggest something that others don't find, then I'm going to be skeptical. But it's a really handy source, and for small businesses in particular, there's no reason you shouldn't be using this information. It's relatively inexpensive, it's easy to get, it requires a little bit of effort. But I hear small business people tell me frequently about how they can't afford to do market research. Well, they may not be able to afford hundreds of thousands of dollars going out and doing big surveys. But they can go to the Census Bureau site and get information about their local zip code. That's right there, readily accessible. So there's really good information even for the smallest of businesses. Inevitably, though, the information that we find out there in the world is not going to answer all of our questions. There may be no information at all on our particular question. There may be information, but it's now old. The world may have changed. So that often means that we have to go and actually collect data ourselves, or have a market research firm collect data for us. And there are two types of research where we collect data. One is what we call qualitative research. By the way, qualitative research tends to be something people really enjoy participating in, both as respondents and as users. And all qualitative research is just an exploratory technique. If you don't know anything about a market, you can't do a survey. You have to know a lot to do a survey. You've got to know who to survey. You've got to know what questions to ask. In a lot of cases, you also need to know what answers to give them to choose from. We often don't know enough to do a survey. But qualitative research is really a good place to start because it really involves talking to the customer. As a result, it tends to be most useful really early in the planning cycle, when you don't know a lot. And so rather than run off and try to do a lot of quantitative research that's likely to be wrong, go find some customers and have a conversation. What you get is data that's not numeric, it's qualitative. That's why it's called qualitative research. It's descriptive. It tells me what people said they like and don't like about a particular product or service. It tells me how they evaluate quality. But this is a really powerful form of research because unlike a survey where you usually contract with a market research firm and they go off and collect the data, analyze it, bring you back a nice report, and you never see a customer. The best qualitative research actually involves direct contact between the market or the firm and the customer. And that's very powerful information. I mean, it's one thing to have a report that says something. It's quite another thing when a customer tells you something and you can see all of the emotion, the passion that's present around their response. You don't get that in surveys. And qualitative research tends to be most effective when it's part of an ongoing effort to understand the market, to try to see what changes are occurring, what's staying the same. I'll talk about 3 types of qualitative research, but we need to talk about some characteristics they all share. First of all, they tend to involve small samples. But when I say small, I don't mean tiny. 1 or 2 people is not enough. But because what we're trying to do is to really understand the customer, we want to spend a lot of time with that customer. And so we sacrifice a big sample for spending a lot of time with an individual customer. Procter & Gamble calls several thousand people every year and says, would you mind if we came and visited with you and talked to you about our laundry detergents? By the way, we'd like to come to your home. Oh, I know it's an intrusion. We'll pay you $100. Oh, and by the way, we'd like to watch you do your laundry while we're there and talk to you while you're doing your laundry. And so they observe, and as they observe, they ask questions. Why do you use that detergent? Why are you washing in cold water there instead of hot water? Oh, there's a stain. How do you usually get those stains out? You're getting a lot of really rich information that you really could not get easily out of a survey. But you can only get that from relatively modest numbers of people. To give you an indication of how many is enough, if the question were, I'd like to understand all of the problems people in a marketplace have with my product, not how often they have the problem, not how many people have the problem, just I want a list of the problems. I only need to talk to about 25 people to identify 95% of the problems. And that's the power of qualitative research. Now, by the way, I've identified the problems. I could do a survey, and I could go out and ask a much larger group, check the problems you've had, and I can actually count. But I can't really do that until I know what the set of problems are. We use something called purposive sampling rather than random sampling. What we mean by purposive sampling is we go find people who we think can give us the information we want. Oftentimes, a random sample is going to be completely useless for answering certain questions. So, for example, if I'm interested in what's the next generation of antibiotics going to look like? Well, my guess is that if I had that conversation with everybody in this room, we wouldn't learn much. So who's got that information? In fact, we can even go talk to physicians, and just a random sample of physicians, we probably won't get really good information about the next generation of antibiotics. But there are people, physicians and scientists, working in research centers, working for the Center for Disease Control, who know this stuff. You know, and they can really give you good insights into that. And so we want to go find those people because they can give us the information. And that's what we mean by purposive sampling. The focus is really on qualities, you know, by list of problems as opposed to quantities. And the emphasis really is on how and why. I really want to tell a story here. But because it's a small sample, because it may not be representative of the larger market, it's useful learning, but we always need to verify it in some other way. But it's a great place to start. And when you think about the market in the context of qualitative research, there are lots of people in the market. There are certainly end users. By the way, end users are not always the decision makers. Children are end users of lots of products. Sometimes they're the decision maker, but sometimes they're not. In business-to-business marketing, there are a lot of employees who may be using products and services, but they weren't the ones involved in buying. Now, I want to talk to users if I want to understand something about problems with the product. What kind of problems are you having with the product you use? What kind of quality issues are you having? Is it convenient to use it? A user has to be the person who tells me that. But in a lot of organizations, a lot of families, the user is not the decision maker. So I may need to talk to decision makers. And by the way, this can get very complex. In a business, you might have somebody who's a technical decision maker. They're specifying the particular technical characteristics of the product. And then you may have a financial decision maker who's really primarily interested in what's it going to cost to maintain over time, are there any financing issues? Both are involved in decisions, but they're involved in very different decisions. A really, really useful group of people to get to know, particularly if you're in innovative, high-tech, creative industries, are what we call lead customers. Lead customers tend to be at the cutting edge of buying new products. When I did some work a few years ago for a software company, I asked for the list of people who routinely broke their software. What I was really looking for there were people who were really stretching the software to its limits. And I wanted to understand what they were trying to do that the software wouldn't do. That's a lead user. There may be third-party intermediaries. You don't always think about this, but you might need to go talk to members of the distribution channel, retailers. It's a really new-to-the-world product. Where would they put it in the store? when Hewlett-Packard first came out with its all-in-one product, you know, the combination printer, copier, fax, scanner, they had real trouble getting distribution. And the reason was that the office stores, office supply stores, didn't have an aisle for that type of product. They had an aisle for printers, they had an aisle for scanners, they had an aisle for fax machines. Where do you put the all-in-one? Well, if they had gone and talked with some retailers in advance, which they ultimately did, they would have discovered that they were basically creating a problem for retailers that could only be resolved by reorganizing at least a portion of the store. By the way, the reason they got this was really insightful for them because they actually didn't pay retailers to rearrange their store. But now they have their product in the store. Really interesting people are competitors' customers. They're not like your customers. If they were like your customers, they'd be buying from you. So you want to understand, why aren't you buying from me? Why are you buying from somebody else over there? What do you like about their product? Or what don't you like about my product? And finally, there are a whole host of people who are what we call opinion leaders or influencers, people who write product reviews, people who test products. These people can often provide really interesting insights, depending on the question that you get. As I've said, this is most useful early in the planning cycle, most useful when you want sensitive or strategic information. You know, you might think people are much more willing to give sensitive information when they have an anonymous survey that they're filling out. It's not actually true. People are, if you build rapport with people and they find that you're really interested, they will often share all kinds of things with you. Early in my career, when I was in advertising, I was sent off to Boston to do some interviews, qualitative interviews, with people who suffer from hemorrhoids. Everybody knows what hemorrhoids are? One of our clients actually sold a product for hemorrhoid relief. Now you might think that would be a subject people would not want to talk about, they'd be embarrassed. However, once they realized that I was interested, they told me all kinds of things. It was almost cathartic, because it's a topic they don't talk with many people about. But now suddenly there's an interested person across the table. Oh, yeah, let me tell you. So it can be very powerful, particularly if you've built a relationship. This is also a really great way to train new employees. Put them in front of customers and let them see what a customer looks like and how they talk and how they view the world. It's amazing how many people work for organizations and they've never seen a customer. It's kind of hard to be helpful to a customer when you don't know them. Now the job may be one where they may never have any interaction with a customer on a routine basis. Maybe they're in the back office. But having some notion of who the customer is and how the business is serving them can be very, very powerful. If you really need to understand the world of your user, these can be very powerful tools. Because you can go to the user. You need to go observe the world. My Procter & Gamble example. I want to come watch you do your laundry. I'm going to learn something about why you do what you do and how we can improve our product. Intuit, the company that makes Quicken, uses qualitative research quite a lot. They ask to come watch people use Quicken. And what they do is they watch them do their normal transactions, reporting of transactions, but ask questions along the way. So often what will happen is that the cursor will get moved to someplace on the screen and there's nothing there. And the interviewer will say, why did you move the cursor there? And often the reason they moved the cursor there is they were expecting something to be there. It was not. That's really helpful if you're designing a piece of software. Particularly a piece of software that is supposed to be intuitive, as in Intuit. By the way, when Intuit releases new versions of its software engineers actually sit with the call desk and listen into the calls for help. Another piece of qualitative research, what problems are people having? Well, if we hear them firsthand, then we can go and maybe fix them. If there are multiple decision makers involved in planning, and there usually are, getting them all out in front of a set of customers, the same set of customers, can actually help create a common vision. Give them all a survey, and we can argue about the survey. It's kind of hard to argue when you all see this live human being talking about some product and problem they have. And as a result, what we find is that firms that do a lot of this type of research actually don't have nearly as much conflict because they have a common view. It's not at all unusual for marketing and manufacturing or manufacturing and R&D to have conflict. R&D wants to make the latest, greatest, most innovative, whatever. Manufacturing wants to make it cheap. Well, they're kind of at loggerheads. But if we get them in front of the customer, and the customer says, I don't want cheap, I want low cost, but I'm not willing to give up this feature, this feature, this feature. Now we have a common vision to take back. Manufacturing understands that there are certain features that must be present. It costs something, so it's not going to be the lowest cost product we can produce, but maybe one people want. Meantime, R&D has heard, you can't put every bell and whistle in the thing because people are not going to pay for that. 3 types, and their variations, 3 types of qualitative research. First, is what we call in-depth individual interviews. You identify a customer. You can either bring them to your own location or you can go visit them. And you can have a conversation. This could be a half hour, it could be an hour and a half. It could be while they're doing some work. It could be while they're doing their laundry. It could be while they are washing dishes. But you have a conversation. And they ask questions that are relevant to whatever you're planning. What product do you use? Why do you use that one? Why don't you use others? What's important to you when you buy? Is price really important? When you think about price, how do you think about pricing? Well, I want to show you an ad. Tell me what you think of the ad. What was the main message here? Anything you didn't understand? Those are the kinds of questions that you want to ask. And in some cases, this type of research is ongoing. Boeing has its customers as members of their product development teams. Who are Boeing's customers? Airlines. So they have representatives of the airlines on their product teams. And they use this type of interviewing as a way of gathering information about the design of their next version of airplane. And they learn really interesting things. One of the things they learn is that airlines don't make any money when airplanes are on the ground. They only make money when they're flying. So if you have to keep a plane on the ground for a long time for maintenance or for reconfiguring the interior, they're losing money. Many planes get reconfigured regularly because they're flying different routes. And so they'll put more seats in one section than another to respond to the nature of the market they're serving. Reconfiguring the interior of an airplane takes a lot of time. And one of the things they discovered talking to their customers was just this fact. So as a result, in Boeing's, actually the last two generations of their aircraft, the lavatories and galleys, which is usually what divides the sections of planes, are actually located on rails. And so they can slide. Now, not while you're flying, but they can be locked in place. But they can slide in either direction. So you can really easily expand one section and contract another section really fast. And that's important because when they are not flying, they're not making money. But that's individual in-depth interviews. Another example, NCR, used to be National Cash Register. They don't make cash registers anymore. They make point-of-sale terminals. Actually did some of this research. They went out to do in-depth interviews with managers of fast food restaurants to talk about their point-of-sale terminals. And these are really high-tech people. They get involved with networks and computers and whatever. So they really expected to hear the managers talking about the great technology. Managers weren't terribly interested in technology. What do you think their biggest problems with point-of-sale terminals were? First of all, their employees. Because if the only thing that's on the buttons are numbers, this requires employees to understand math. The labor force that works for many fast food restaurants is not very facile in math, in making change. This is why today you'll see in a lot of point-of-sale terminals pictures of the product. They don't have to input numbers. They just have to trust the nature of the product. The other thing they were very concerned about was that they needed to be waterproof. Because what happens in fast food restaurants? Things get spilled. And electronic and soft drinks don't mix very well. So they had to harden these things. But again, it was the sort of thing they learned because they went and talked on site with the managers about what their world was about and what problems they had. Sometimes it's not really efficient to go and seek individuals. There may not be enough differences among individuals to warrant all the time with each individual. So we may bring a group of customers together. And this is called a focus group. It's typically done in a special facility. There's actually one just down here at the corner of Lincoln and Marymount, Product Associates. Rented out. Typically you bring 10 to 12 people together with a trained moderator, because interviewing a dozen people is a skill in itself. And you have a conversation. And while you don't learn a lot, certainly not as much about each individual as you would in the interview individually, the group interaction actually makes similarities and differences come out really quickly. Oh, I do this. I don't do that. Well, I like that. Oh, I like that too. And so you begin to get really quickly some insight into what people share and what they don't have in common. Those are focus groups. And finally, a variant of in-depth individual interviews are what we call customer visits. This is often done in the context of business to business, where you'll take a team and you'll go visit the site of a customer. This is not a sales call. You're there just to learn. While you're there, you may talk to multiple people. You may talk to an end user. Let me talk to a financial decision maker. Let me talk to who makes the technical specifications. Oh, I want to see how the product is used. And now you get a lot of insight into the customer's world. We talked about purposive sampling already, not random. You really do want to seek out knowledgeable individuals who's got the information that you want, but you also want to build in some diversity. So if I'm talking to hospitals, for example, I might want to have some hospitals that are teaching and research hospitals, and general care hospitals, because their worlds are a little bit different. In fact, I might want to have some from urban areas and some from rural areas, because their worlds are going to be somewhat different. So I want to try to identify a few key characteristics and kind of build that in, so I get a sense of how that diversity to the extent it exists might change people's opinions. But I want diversity in terms of setting, where people are using the product or service, maybe their expertise, what role they might play in the purchase process. When I was at McDonald's, we did lots of focus groups with Boy Scout and Girl Scout troops. You always see 8 to 10-year-olds wandering through the halls. And why? Well, they have a lot to say about fast food restaurants. And by the way, while parents will tell you they are not the decision maker, maybe not, but they sure have a lot of influence. When a kid says, "Ooh, I want to go there," you typically don't go there. In fact, kids have a lot of influence on lots of things. Automobiles. I don't know that. Applications are used. Are people using the product in the same way? Or are there differences? Well, if there are differences in the way people use it, you need to represent that. And then what we talked about, are they a current customer or are they not? For focus groups, the optimal size typically is somewhere between 8 and 12. And you need to give some consideration to who's in the group. So if you do a focus group with mothers and their teenage daughters, you will get a very different interaction than if you take the teenage daughters alone, or the moms alone, for that matter. Because the composition of the group changes the interaction. It doesn't make one right or wrong, it just is a different way of looking at the market. I talked about NCR, I talked about Intuit and Procter & Gamble. One interesting company is DuPont. DuPont's been around for 200 plus years. DuPont is a business-to-business company, and they sell way back in the value chain. I mean, they're selling specialty and commodity chemicals, which then get turned into something else, that gets turned into something else, that gets turned into something else. Their largest customer is Burlington Industries. Burlington Industries is a textile company that basically make bread. And the thread then goes into other things, fashion products, carpet. Carpet then gets sold to carpet distributors and then ultimately the end user customer. Well, many years ago, DuPont began to realize that the driver of demand was the end user customer. So they really needed to understand that end user. And so what they spend their time doing is they actually go out to each of the intermediaries. They go to Burlington Industries, they go to a carpet mill, they go to a retailer, they go to an end user, and they do qualitative research with all of them, which gives them enormous expertise in the whole industry. So much so that they're kind of the captains of the industry. And so they have a lot of influence with their immediate customers, with distributors. When they went out and talked to customers about, end user customers, about their biggest problem with carpet, what do you think they heard? What's a really big problem with carpet? Stains. So guess what DuPont sells now? Stain resistance. You go to buy carpet now, you'll actually see a DuPont label that says DuPont stain resistant. An enormous amount of value for everybody in the valley. But they figured that out because they wouldn't talk to customers. That's qualitative research. Now let me talk about quantitative research. All quantitative research, where we're actually collecting data, involves some type of survey methodology. So what that means is that we need a relatively large sample, not huge, but relatively large. It needs to be random because we want to be sure we're representing the larger market. It needs a questionnaire design that is standardized. Because we ask different questions, we're going to get different answers. But that's not very helpful. And ultimately, we like to have numeric summaries. But there are many different types of surveys, and they differ to a large extent in the type of information we gather. But before I talk about the three types of quantitative research, let me just talk about differences between qualitative and quantitative research. Qualitative research answers questions about what kind. Quantitative research answers questions about how many. But notice I can't answer the question how many until I know how many of what. And that's why qualitative research is really useful. But what might be problems, it might be characteristics of products, it might be usage situations, but I need qualitative research to help figure that out. With quantitative results, quantitative surveys, I'm interested in projectability. I want to be able, at the end, to say something about the market as a whole, or at least some subset of the market. That's not what I'm trying to do with qualitative research. With qualitative research, I want to understand. I want a depth of understanding. Okay, I know you don't like this. Why not? In fact, sometimes we, in customer satisfaction surveys, we will often combine the two. We'll give people a survey. Please rate my product on a 1 to 7 scale. And then I will come back and say, you gave me a 2. Why did you give me a 2? Can you explain that? And by the way, you'll get much better answers when you're face to face with the person asking that question than if you simply say on the survey, please tell us why. You get 3 words on the survey. You may get half an hour in the conversation. With surveys, we're interested in precision and accuracy. We want to be right, or at least close to right. With qualitative research, we want to be right too, but what we're really interested in is discovery. I want to learn things I didn't know before. I'm almost never surprised by what I find in the survey. Yeah, the numbers may be a little different than I expected, but I already knew a lot when designing the survey. Qualitative research tells me things I just didn't dream that people would think that way. By the way, it's also really important to do this early in planning. Because people are most likely, managers are most likely to respond to surprises when they can still actually do something about them. If you find something surprising as the new product comes off the production line, there's not much you can do about it. There was a critical feature that we forgot. Oops. Maybe we should ask people about that before we started planning. With quantitative research, we're interested in things that are unbiased, very controlled. We're not so interested in control. We really are interested in qualitative research, in things that are immediate, that are vivid. We want to see the emotion, or the passion, or the anger. And that's a part of the response, and we'd like to see that. And then finally, with quantitative research, ultimately at the end of the day, we want numbers. With qualitative research, we want something that's more integrated. We want to tell a story. We want to tell a story of this customer. Let me tell you about their day. And by the way, here's how our product fits into that day. And this is why they don't like our product, because they have these problems with it. And this is how it disrupts the rest of their day. And by the way, it's so disruptive, they told us that they would pay twice what they're paying now if they actually had a product that worked. And that's the kind of thing we're trying to get at. 3 types of surveys. The most common are what we call descriptive surveys. They're just designed to describe something. You can do this in a variety of ways. You can do it on the internet, you can do it by phone, you can do it by mail, do it in person. Lots of ways to collect the data. But basically, you're trying to describe something. It might be the characteristics of the customer. Who are they? Male, female, what's their age? Might be something about their activities. What television shows do they watch? What magazines do they read? Are they important if I'm trying to advertise and schedule media? What products do they use? How satisfied are they with the products? Have you seen any of my advertising lately? I mean, these are all descriptions of some sort or another. And what I'm trying to do is to capture data from a representative sample so that I can then extrapolate to the larger market. So I can now say something like, my market has these characteristics. It looks like it's predominantly female between the ages of 34 and 55, with incomes in a particular range, who live in a particular type of neighborhood. That's the kind of thing that they're running. And descriptive surveys can do lots of wonderful things for us. First of all, they can help us identify and define market opportunities. How many customers are there? They can help us identify how we're doing in the marketplace. How many people are aware that we have a product? How many people are satisfied with our product? And sometimes it can help us identify the cause of the problem. What kind of problem are we having? When? Why? In bikes, you've actually got descriptive surveys. You've got a customer awareness survey. You've got an intention survey. You've got shopping habits. But there are a number of things that descriptive surveys cannot do. They can't generate alternatives for you. I mean, people don't make stuff up on surveys. The fact that they do, you wouldn't be concerned. If you really want customers to co-create with you, to generate ideas, ideas about a product, service, and ad, they really ought to use qualitative research where you can actually have a dialogue. They don't do a very good job of testing what alternatives test, or of forecasting how much you're going to achieve of something. A couple of other tools that answer those questions. And the reason for that is, first of all, what people tell you they want isn't always what they will choose. Because what people choose is often influenced by price. It's often influenced by other people. Now, it's nice to know that my neighbor would like a Porsche. He owns a pickup truck. By the way, there's a reason. He can't afford a Porsche. And his wife says he can't have one. Surveys are also problematic in the sense that consumers often view needs, when they do ratings, they often view needs in absolutes without any thought of competitors. So there's some product categories, service categories, where if you ask people what's important, everything is important. Healthcare, what's important? Short wait time, high quality of care, low cost. I mean, yeah, right. I can't deliver that. It's going to have to be a trade-off. But, well, you asked me what's important. I just told you what's important. Well, that doesn't help you design the product. It doesn't help you understand the trade-offs. Now, it might be important to know that something is important or not. By the way, there are other categories where nothing's really important. Toilet paper. Ask people what's important in toilet paper. Mostly, as long as it doesn't have wood chips in it, they're probably fine. The questions in surveys have a tendency, descriptive surveys have a tendency to tell people exactly what we're interested in. And this can be a real problem for certain kinds of questions. For example, for pricing. Would you prefer a higher price or a lower price? Well, I kind of know how that's going to come out. People just are aware of what's being researched. And finally, there's a problem not so much with collecting the data, but with the way data are often analyzed in surveys, descriptive surveys. And that is, we usually present averages. This is what the average customer looks like. Well, the problem with that is that nobody in the market may look like the average. One of the most important statistics that you will want to look at when looking at markets is the variability. Average is okay, but is there a lot of variability or little variability? There's a lot of variability. Maybe I can't serve that market with just one product. Maybe I need multiples. So what you want to do is take a look at how much difference is there among the respondents. If instead of put your head in the refrigerator and your feet in the oven, on average, you're comfortable. No, you're not. That's the same is true with averages in the marketplace. There's variability, and we want to understand the variability because there's actually opportunity in variability. When we talk about customer satisfaction a bit later in the course, I will explain why firms with really large market shares often have the most dissatisfied customers. And the reason is because they have managed to find a market in which people are buying the least objectionable alternative. I don't like anything that's in the market, but I'm buying that one because it's the least objectionable. You really don't want to be the least objectionable product. You're really going to be vulnerable to loss of customers if somebody comes in. Descriptive surveys can be very powerful for answering some questions. They can tell us how big a market is. So you can ask, who's in the market? What are their characteristics? What are they in the market for? How are they going to use the product? How often are they going to use the product? When are they going to use the product? If I can answer those questions, I can put a pretty good gauge on the size of the total market. Not necessarily my share of that market, but I can get a pretty good sense of the size of the market. So, for example, if I'm interested in the size of the market for disposable diapers for babies, I think we'll get information. First of all, the who is actually pretty easy. In fact, they don't even need to do a survey to get the who, because the government collects data on who's been born and what their age is. But, I might discover something about in a survey about, how they're used, how often they're used, when they're used, put that together with the number of babies of a particular age. I've got a pretty good sense of how many diapers I'm going to sell in the total market. I showed you this very early in the course, and I'll repeat it again, and you'll see it again, because it's one of the most powerful formulas in marketing. If I know the size of the market, that's the market potential, and I can get that with my descriptive survey, and I know the level of awareness of my product, I know how many people can get my product, and I know how many people will choose my product if they are aware and can get it, I can compute my sales volume. In fact, if I take market potential out of the equation and just use this portion of it, that's market share. I can get awareness from a survey. I can simply take a survey out and say, what products are you aware of? I can get availability with a survey. Where do you shop? And I can actually get choice with the survey. So it's very, very powerful. Choice is a special issue, though. We don't really use descriptive surveys so much. Although sometimes we do. Sometimes we ask for purchase intention. When we are confronted with questions about choice, we have two very special survey tools that we use. Would you prefer this product or that product? That's a choice. Would you prefer feature A or feature B? That's a choice. So with simple questions, such as I just indicated, marketing experiments are very commonly used. And a term that you'll often hear for these in today's digital world are A/B tests. Just comparing a couple of alternatives. There's a lot of A/B testing of advertising on the internet and of products on the internet. You know, let's put one of them out and see what happens. Let's put another one out in a different location with a different group of customers. See what happens. Compare the two, and then we know whether there's a difference. For more complex questions such as, what should the feature set be for a smart mobile telephone? It's kind of hard to do that with which would you prefer. Because there are literally millions of different combinations of features you could put on the phone. So we have to do something a little bit different. But let me give you an example. Here's a classic experiment. By the way, if you want to know about optimal pricing, this is really the only way you can do it, is with an experiment. Here's how we would arrange it. We would have a product. By the way, my products all look different, but the description should be the same. Same description of the product at one price. Again, same description of the product, but at a different price. Third description, same description, but at a third price, and then finally at a fourth price. And then I provide descriptions, again, same descriptions across the four groups of my competitors' products. And then I ask people to do something really very simple. I say, if you were buying today, which one would you buy? And so for this group, I get a percentage of people who are choosing my product. For this group, I get a percentage of people choosing my product. For this group, I get a percentage. If there's any difference in the percentage of people choosing my product across the groups, what's causing that? There's only one thing that's different. That's price. So I'm going to have a very clear indication of how people respond to price. By the way, if there's no difference across the groups in the percentage of people choosing my product, what price should I use? The highest price. Because I don't get any more sales if I lower my price. Notice here that we have four different groups. So we take a sample And at random, we assign some to this group, some to this group, some to this group, and some to this group. So we're not saying you prefer price 1 to price 2, or price 2 to price 3. They don't even know that we're interested in price. All we're doing is we're saying, here's some descriptions of products with their prices. Which one would you buy if you were buying today? And then we compare across the groups to determine the influence of the price. Simple little experiment. You can do the same thing with advertising. I have an ad with one claim that I show people, ask a question about how persuasive it is. Have an ad with a different claim, ask how persuasive it is, compare the two. And now I have a sense of whether there's a difference, and if there's a difference, which one seems to work better. Very, very powerful. By the way, not very expensive. I'm not asking people to do very much here. It's pick one, and we're kind of done. Now, this does tend to get complicated if you move beyond simple questions. Because if I were going to add something other than the price here, maybe the presence or absence of a feature, I now would need 8 groups. Presence of the feature in 4 price points, absence of the feature in 4 price points. If I want to add a third feature, now I'm up to 16 groups. And so very quickly, as the number of questions, number of features, characteristics increase, these get really, really big. And pretty quickly are just not tractable. Which is why we then, I'll come back to that later, which is why we sometimes will instead use something called choice modeling. Choice modeling simply involves building a model of choice. So rather than presenting people with every possible combination and having hundreds of groups, in a lot of markets I run out of customers, what I do instead is I build a model of choice, and then I build the effect of choice up from other types of responses. So I need 3 pieces of information. Again, I can get these in a survey. I need people to tell me the relative importance of a feature or benefit. By the way, the key word here is relative. Because if I simply say it's important, everything could be important, or nothing could be important. A very common way we get relative importance is by forcing people to make trade-offs. If I gave you $10, how would you divide the $10 up among these 4 characteristics of the product? Somebody might say, I give this one 5, that one 5, and the other 2 would get 0. Somebody else might say, I'll give 3, 3, 3, and 1. Somebody else might say, I give 10 to this one and none to the others. So I can pick up people's trade-offs. And I really want to force people to make trade-offs because that's what they do in the marketplace. Yeah, I want the highest quality, lowest price product. Well, you can't have it. Tell me the trade-off. The second thing I need, and again I can get this from a survey, are the perceptions of performance. How are all the competitors in the market performing? And I can ask people to rate performance on various characteristics and benefits. In fact, in some business-to-business markets, you don't even need a survey, you just use the spec sheet. Because that's the way a lot of professional purchasing agents buy, they just compare the spec sheets. And lastly, I need some information about how they put this information together to arrive at a choice. And we call that decision rules. And there are different decision rules, and we really don't have time in this course to talk about all the ways in which people may make decisions, but for relatively inexpensive, frequently purchased products, the choice rule for most customers is actually very simple. And that's to take the most important characteristic and use that to make a choice. And they're done. By the way, when we develop brand, what we're trying to do is to get people to make that most important characteristic brand. Because if it's my brand, nobody else has it. So I win. I want people to use my brand as the basis for choice. And if there's still 2 or more products that are left in the market after individuals have compared to the first attribute, they can add a second attribute. And then a third attribute. And pretty soon they have only one left. In other cases, people make trade-offs. So, then we need to know the nature of the trade-offs they're making and include them here. It's basically a way of weighting the information. So, what I've done is give you a really quick tour of 3 of the most common forms of qualitative research and 3 of the most common forms of quantitative research. There are some other tools out there, but these are generally the way that we collect data. You need to know which tool answers what type of question, and obviously that means you need to know what question you have to answer. I get calls periodically in my role as a consultant. Somebody calls and says, I need some market research. And my immediate response is, what would you like to know? Because until you know what you need to know, you don't know what tool to use. Moving in the wrong direction at a fast pace is still moving in the wrong direction. And in today's internet world, there's a lot of business decisions that get made because we need to be quick. Being quick doesn't make them right. And taking some time to identify what you don't know, and then going and collecting information to help you answer the question about what you don't know, pays huge dividends. By the way, remember QFD? The choice modeling that I just talked about feeds directly into QFD. Because you need information on people's trade-offs, how competitors perform, and so forth. I will close by simply, I'm going to come back to some of this. I will close by simply saying that market research pays off the most in the situation where you don't know much, there's a lot of uncertainty, and the stakes are really high. The cost of being wrong is really high. If the cost of being wrong isn't very much, and you can correct it quickly, there's probably no need for market research. If you're certain of what you're going to do already, just go do it. If the information isn't going to make any difference. But where you have uncertainty and you're willing to listen to the data, listen to the market, and where there's a lot at stake, taking time to collect some data, incurring some cost to collect the data, really pays off, and it's an incredibly powerful way to manage risk. And a lot of the riskiness of business decisions occurs because people are making them when they're ignorant.